Peter sat in shock as he listened to his fiancée finish her statement. His anger surged through his body. Pete was driving to the show for their regular date when he asked Polly if she wanted to take a week and go camping with him after her college classes ended next month. Polly said, "Pete, you know I am leaving the day after classes are over. Shelley, Emma and I already have almost all our things packed ready to leave. You know we are taking the whole summer for a trip out west. Polly, if you think I'll allow that, you're crazy. I thought when we decided to get married you agreed not to go on this damn trip. What changed your mind?" "Oh, Peter, I never said that. You know we've been planning on taking this trip ever since we started college. We have been saving every cent we could to pay for it, but we will still have to work some on the trip unless we can find someone to help pay our way. Do you know how hard it was to cut costs and overstate our expenses so our parents would give us more money to save for the trip? How could you even think for a minute I would miss out on the trip of a lifetime? Polly, I know how those two friends of yours get when they get away from home. I also know how they find someone to help them pay expenses they can't cover themselves. When they get a drink or two in them, their heels get round, and they fall onto their backs in the dying cockroach position. Hell, I have nightmares of seeing them in different position after one of your girls' nights out. I don't want you to even go out alone with them here, and I sure don't want you to spend the summer with them 24/7. You scumsucker. Those are my best friends. I will not allow you to talk about them like that. I am sorry, honey, but it's a done deal. You knew when we started dating I planned to take this trip. Nothing has changed. You go off on your short reserve trips and I trust you. What's the difference here?" "Polly, you know what the difference is. I am a citizen soldier. I go to training and onto active duty if and when I am called up. It is part of my job. When I am there, I work. Mostly I don't have time to chase girl even if I had the desire. If you take this trip, we won't last. Even if you aren't planning to cheat on me, you will get drunk and slip, or those two will talk you into cheating. I promise you that will end us. I won't let you take off like that and expect to come back and find it like it is now. Is that what you want? Are you trying to break up with me?" "Oh, no, honey. Never. You're my main man, and will be even after this little trip is over. We'll go off and see the good old US of A, then I'll come back to you and be your own personal woman for the rest of my life." "Polly, I had better be your only man. If you do this trip, you'll never be my woman again. I won't put up with you sleeping around and running around with those two bitches." "Oh, silly. Of course I'll be your woman. I told you I would come home, and you'd be my main man. Now let it go. I don't want to talk about it anymore." The rest of the evening was a blur in Pete's mind. He knew he and Polly went to the movies as they had planned, but he could not remember what the show was about, or any of the rest of their conversation. He spent most of the time the show ran thinking about Polly, her friends, and her insistence she go on their planned trip. He also thought about some of the statements she had made over the last year they had been dating. They held a certain amount of contempt for him and displayed her selfish attitude. Pete noticed with shock that the credits were streaming on the screen and people were leaving the theater. Polly stood and took his hand to leave. They didn't tarry after the show and get a snack or drink at their normal hangout. Pete just took Polly straight home, walked her to her door, and turned to leave. He stopped when she grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Pete, what's the matter with you? We didn't stop for supper and a drink like we usually do, and now you're just going to leave me at the door. Aren't you coming in like you usually do? I was really looking forward to you staying again tonight." "No, Polly, I am not coming in. I don't know when I'll come in again if I ever do. You have to decide what you want before I do that again. I promise you one thing right now, though. If you go whoring around with your friends like you plan to do this summer, I promise you'll never see me in your house or bed again." Pete walked off. Polly reached for him again, but missed his arm. She trotted 3 steps after him, then wailed, "Pete, you didn't even kiss me goodnight. Why are you being like this anyway?" She glared at him as he opened his truck door and looked over the roof at her. As he started to get into his little Ranger, she screamed, "Damn you, Pete. Just go off and sulk. I am taking that trip and that's final. When we get back, we can set the date for our wedding. Now get over it and stop sulking." Polly turned and was closing the door to her house before Pete drove off. She looked up at her 2 best friends in the world as they stood watching her. Both of them were grinning. Emma said, "I guess he didn't take it too well, huh?" Polly shook her head no, then grinned a little. She said, "He'll get over it. He always does when I put my foot down. Besides, he knows he can't find a girl like mine." She laughed and continued, "Of course, if I ever find out he has been sleeping with someone else's, I'll make sure he doesn't do any sex again for a long time." Shelley laughed and said, "And just how do you think that attitude is fair, you bitch?" "Oh, shut up. You know I don't share my man with anyone." Emma laughed and said, "Bullshit. You shared Jared with me Wednesday night." "Well, that was just an animated tool. Peter's my man and I won't share him. I could care less about the other males in my life." I am not going to marry one of them. I just screw them. Now, where are we going to make our first stop, girls? I am thinking maybe Butte or Bozeman, Montana. I feel like riding a cowboy for a while before we get any more educated idiots between our legs. Pete didn't call or visit with Polly again before she left with her friends on the trip of a lifetime. The day after their proposed departure, he did go to Polly's apartment to verify she actually left. The apartment was vacant. He went to Polly's parents' house to see if she was there. He really didn't want to spend the money for the gas, but he wanted to physically verify her presence or lack of it. It was only a little over 100 miles after all. His little four-cylinder Ranger got almost 26 miles to the gallon, so the cost wouldn't break him up. Besides wanting to verify Polly had indeed taken the trip, he needed to return all of Polly's belongings she left in his apartment. He had no intention of ever seeing her again, and certainly didn't want her personal possessions in his house any longer. When Pete got to Polly's home, her father informed him she left on her trip as planned. From the conversation, Pete came to realize Mr. Parker was no happier with his youngest daughter than was Pete. It took them maybe 15 minutes to move her belongings into the house and stack the boxes in her bedroom. Pete shook hands with her father and drove off, heading back to his lonely apartment. Pete was 2 years older than Polly, but was a year behind her in college. He had just finished his associate's degree in construction management. He planned to obtain a bachelor's degree in project management and after a few years' experience form his own building construction firm. He was also a staff sergeant in a National Guard engineer company. Between his part-time jobs, the GI Bill, and his reserve pay, Pete had managed to get this far in college with no debt. He lived in a dump for sure, but he paid his own way. He had no close relatives and no savings, so it was pay as you go or pile up a large debt to pay for college. When his parents died, his father's construction company went bankrupt. All their savings and property was used to pay expenses from their auto accident. All Pete received from his father's side of the family was a small 80-acre piece of ground in the country. His grandparents left him the land when they died. There was no house on the land. There was a small older building. A few pieces of ancient machinery were stored in. When he went to his farm, he camped in the machine shed or alongside a nice little stream in a cave. After he returned from Polly's childhood home, Pete terminated his rental agreement on his small apartment. He took all his possessions to his farm and began camping there. He still attended his reserve meetings and did his 2-week summer camp, but other than that he stayed on his little piece of ground. At first he lay around, fished, swam, drank, and felt sorry for himself. The pity party lasted almost a week before his funk lifted, and he began his exercise regimen once again. He was, after all, a staff sergeant in the reserves. He had to keep himself in shape before he could perform his duties properly. After 3 weeks lying around, Pete was bored. He walked out into the machine shed and looked at all the equipment. He knew the old tractor would start. He used it fairly often to bush hog brush and grass around the place. It was still early enough he could plow up some of the ground and put out a late crop of soybeans. He knew he would have to hire them combined, but what the heck? It would be something to do, and he might make a few extra dollars. Pete hooked up his plow and started toward the field. He had only made a few passes back and forth when one of the neighbors pulled up and stopped. The neighbor got out of his truck and stood watching Pete work. When Pete got close to him, he stopped his tractor and walked over to the neighbor. The man asked, "What you plowing for, Pete?" Hell, I was bored and got to remembering when Grandpa used to farm some. I thought I would maybe put in some soybeans. I can get a crop of them in and harvested this year, I think." "Yeah, boy, you can. If you put out short-season beans, you can probably get a pretty good crop, but why you plowing?" "Hell, except for a garden, nobody plows much anymore. We mostly just spray and kill the grass and weeds and no-till in the crops. Saves time and money. It also adds humus to the soil and protects from erosion and helps hold moisture for the crops. No more than you are putting out here. I can loan you my machinery if you want. Course you break it, you gotta pay to fix it." "Well, I don't know, Mr. Jeffers. I ain't no-till before. I wouldn't know how to do that." "Well, tall as some of these weeds are, you should probably bush hog first, then use Roundup to spray and kill the grass and weeds. After that, you just use my no-till drill mostly like you would your old drill and plant the beans. Get Roundup ready seed so you can spray again after they're up a little and you're all set. You decided to do corn or wheat next year, you do it just the same." Pete thought about what Mr. Jeffers said the rest of the evening. It would sure save him a lot of time and fuel if he could do the no-till planting. He decided to give it a try. He had an old spray rig he thought he could get working. He knew his bush hog would work because he used it off and on during the warmer weather. Early the next morning, Pete began cutting the field. With his small equipment, it took him 4 days to do the job, but he stuck with it. After he finished, he hooked up his disc and smoothed out the area. He plowed, then went to the neighbors to see about borrowing his no-till planter. He had already purchased the seed for his crop. When Pete drove up to Mr. Jeffers' house, he found him working in his machine shed on a tall, heavy-built drill. Pete grinned and got out of his truck. He walked up to Mr. Jeffers and held his hand out to shake. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Jeffers. If you're still willing to loan me your no-till drill, I thought I would take you up on borrowing it. I want to no-till my beans this crop, and then I will check to see if it is better and cheaper for me to do that, or put in a crop the old-fashioned way. Hell, Pete, I guarantee you, it is lots easier and cheaper to no-till. And I would appreciate it if you would call me by my name. It's Stan. Hell, you're all grown up now and a man in your own right. We're neighbors and I hope friends, so you don't need to call me Mr. Jeffers. Hell, I hear you're a sergeant in the reserves too. You want me to call you Sergeant?" Pete said, "Hell no. I'm not a sergeant out here." "Well, I guess I am, but since you're not in the military, I'd rather you call me Pete." "That's what I mean, boy. I'd rather be called Stan by my adult neighbors and friends. Now, let's get this drill over to your place and get you started. I'll help you hook your tractor up to this drill here, and I'll tell you how to use it. I'll stick around a while, and make sure you get started okay too." Even with the late start, Pete only took part of 2 days to get the beans drilled. He made sure to clean up the drill for Stan and took it home. His next project was to find the money for fertilize and get it spread on the field. Before he did that, he took several samples across the field. He took the dirt samples to the county agent for testing to see what mix of fertilize and lime he needed to apply. To his relief, he didn't need to apply any lime and only a small amount of fertilize. He bought the fertilize at the local coop and used one of their spreaders to apply it to the field. After almost 2 weeks of long, hot days' work, Pete finally found time to sit in front of his cave and relax. He was pleased with his work and looked forward to harvesting a cash crop in the fall. He sat back and listened to the small stream running down the hillside beside his cave. He could hear cattle lowing in the background and machinery working in one of the neighbors' fields. Pete sat and relaxed, letting his mind wander. While he listened to the peaceful sounds of his country home, Pete thought of Polly. He wondered what Polly was doing. He wondered if she was getting as much tool as he suspected she was. That thought tore at his soul. He knew he would never know what she did on her trip unless she or one of her 304 friends let it slip and word got out. He still wasn't sure what he would do when she returned. He was pretty sure they were over, but there was a slight chance they were not. He needed to think things through. His main problem was trust. He had seen the three of them when they were out drinking and dancing. They were wild. A time or two, he suspected Polly would have let a man take her home if he hadn't been with them. She spent way too much time dancing and flirting with men, in his opinion. Some of the short tours and deployments Pete had been on had caused friction between him and Polly also. Twice while he was deployed, Pete was told Polly was seen out with men. She supposedly looked and acted as if she was on a date. His informants did tell him she was being way too friendly. During one deployment, a friend of his sent him a letter telling him of Polly's adventures. He enclosed a pretty poor picture for him to see. A different friend told Pete after he got home that he personally saw Polly loving up 3 different men at one time, or another while he was in Afghanistan. Pete asked Polly about the reports. Of course, she denied dating while he was gone. Pete chose to accept her and her friend's explanation of her actions, but a small kernel of doubt remained. He knew the friends who told him those things hated Polly enough to only tell him the things that would make her look the worst to Pete. Still, where there is smoke, there is fire. Pete was almost positive Polly had at least done some heavy petting and flirting while he was gone, but hell, almost everyone flirted from time to time while they were out partying. After a 6-pack of his favorite beer, Pete came to a conclusion about his life with Polly. He just plain didn't trust her any longer. He wasn't even sure he still loved her. He was fairly sure if he loved her, the hurt from what he perceived as her cheating and taking the trip would have been greater. Pete wasn't even sure he loved Polly enough to marry, even if she hadn't taken the trip. He was almost positive she didn't love him. At least he was positive she didn't respect him. Her actions and cutting remarks proved that. Pete decided to move on. He would not search Polly out when she returned. He had no intention of returning to any of their old haunts, so the likelihood of seeing her by accident was small. He had only brought her to his farm once, and he believed she would not be able to find him here even if she looked for him when she returned. If she looked him up, he would play their reunion by ear. She would have a tough battle on her hands to ever get back together with him, though. As the summer progressed, Pete continued to work around his little place. If he wasn't doing something for the reserves, he worked on his farm, or at least was on the farm. He turned a garage bay in his machine shed into a small workshop to work on his machinery. He plowed and planted a small garden to raise some of his food for the summer. Right now, he slept in the cave where it was cool. He knew he had to do something about the winter. If he went back to college, he needed to rent an apartment. If he didn't, he needed to figure out where he was going to live during the cold winter months. One day, Pete was once again thinking about school. He was tired of classes. He was happy here on his little farm and doing short tours for the reserves. He decided screw it. He was not returning to college in the fall. Then he began to think about living during the winter. He didn't want to go to town and try to find a place to rent. That would mean finding a job in town, and he really didn't want to do that. That, of course, meant he needed to figure out how to make a place tight enough he could spend the winter on his farm. Pete knew he could cobble something up in the machine shed, but he didn't like the location. He loved sleeping in his little cave. He was high enough above the stream he didn't have to worry about floods, and he could see a beautiful view from in front of the cave. He decided to use some of the old concrete blocks and stones to make a wall across the front of the cave. He already had electricity in the cave. One of the first things he had done when his grandparents left him the farm was run lines the 150 feet from the machine shed to the cave, so he would have lights in the evenings. The opening of the cave under the bluff was only about 30 by 15 or 20 feet. The front was about 10 feet high. He could pick up enough stone and blocks to wall that off easily. The floor wasn't perfectly level, but he could even level it out some with a little concrete in strategic locations. Pete decided he had a plan. Early the next morning he went to town and made the few purchases he needed to get started. He ordered some sand and gravel to make the concrete and mortar. He purchased and took home his cement and some of the building materials he would need immediately. He ordered a good steel door for the front and 2 triple-pane PVC windows. He also ordered some lumber and metal roofing to make a covered porch for his little cave home. Pete snorted to himself and admitted you really couldn't call this a true cave. It was more like a large, overhanging bluff. It was only about 30 feet deep, and the back 6 or 8 feet you couldn't stand in. Pete planned to close off the rear of his home where the wall would be 6 feet tall. He would put another steel door into the back wall, so he could access the part he closed off. He would use the rear for storage if he needed it. The next day his building material was delivered by Home Depot. As soon as the truck left, Pete began getting ready to work. The first thing he did after laying out his proposed walls was hammer drill holes in the rock and place rebar. He formed up and poured concrete to level the area he would build his stone wall on and the cave floor. While that was setting up, Pete measured out and poured a stem wall for his little porch. He was lucky that the drop-off in front of the cave only required a wall 30-inch high at its highest point. After the concrete was dry enough to remove the forms, Pete hauled in river gravel to fill in under his porch floor. Then he mixed and poured the concrete for the 30 by 12-foot porch in front of his little cave home. All this work took him a week to complete. It would have taken even longer if he hadn't had a front-end loader on his small 45-horsepower tractor. The day Pete began mixing and pouring the concrete porch floor, his neighbor across the small stream began cutting the field for hay. When Pete rested, he would sit and watch the tractor go around and around. He had never seen anyone cut hay as fast as they were cutting. He couldn't recall ever seeing the man on the tractor either. He wondered if it was a custom operator or hired help. That afternoon, after the field was cut, the tractor drove to the stream and stopped just across from where Pete was working. The operator got off the tractor and limped toward the stream. As they walked, they took off their shirt. When beside the stream, the operator stopped and removed their shoes, then dropped their long pants. Pete stared in surprise. The tractor operator was a very pretty woman. She looked over at Pete for a moment, then moved into the stream and dunked herself in the small, deep hole. The deep part of the stream where the woman was trying to swim was not really large enough to swim in. It was maybe 12 feet across and 15 feet long. At its deepest point, it was chest high and shoaled rapidly from there. After she had gotten completely wet, the woman lay on her back and just floated in the cool water. Pete found himself watching instead of working. Finally, with a small shake of his head, Pete turned back to his work. For the next 30 minutes, Pete mixed concrete in his small electric mixer and poured it onto his new porch floor. He figured he needed 3 or 4 more mixers full, and he would be done for the day when he heard movement. Then a voice said, "Hello, I am Fiona Morgan. I know it's none of my business, but what the heck are you doing to the old cave here?" Pete said, "Nice to meet you. I am Pete Johnson. I've decided to turn the front part of the cave into my house. I am pouring the front porch right now. I really need to keep working until I get the concrete poured. I am not being rude. I just can't let the concrete get too dry, or it won't set up right on the new pour." "Cool. I always used to like to play around in the cave when I was a girl, and we came down to swim. You mind if I look around for a minute or two?" "Nah, go ahead. I am almost finished here, then I am going to clean up and jump in the creek myself. I'll even wear clothes this evening since you're here." Fiona turned and looked at him when Pete said that. She saw he was smiling and said, "Well, I hope so. I'd hate to have to use my official U.S. Army combat training on you." "You're in the Army?" "I am a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been in a little over 6 years now." "What's your MOS, military occupational specialty?" "I'm not in the Army now. I guess you noticed I don't walk like I should." "Sergeant Fiona Morgan, U.S. Army. Retired would be more accurate for me, I guess. I was a medic and got a little bunged up on a mission. They sewed me back together, but as you can see, I can't get around as well as I need to, so they put me out to pasture. Now I am helping Dad and Mom on the farm while I try to decide what I want to do with the rest of my life. I never had much interest in college, and there aren't many jobs around here, so I am just helping the folks until I decide what to do. I may go on and get my EMT certificate and try to get on with the ambulance district. I sort of enjoyed being a medic. How about you? About the same as you, I guess. I already told you I am a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been on 2 deployments and I take all the short tours I can get. I plan to make the reserves my career. I got my AA degree at the junior college, but I don't want to go on. This 80 acres was Grandpa's and I inherited it from him when he died. I was lucky he lived longer than my dad. Everything Dad and Mom had went to pay their bills after they died in a car wreck. What you see is all I have in the world and I am fine with that. I plan to live here in my cave like a hermit, grow whatever I can on the farm, and take all the short tours I can get from the reserves and then retire. That's it? Just you and your little piece of ground? Don't you ever plan to get married or anything? Pete laughed and said, well, I was planning on getting married and doing the old 9 to 5, but she decided she wanted to run around with her girlfriends instead of me, so we split. She's somewhere out west now drinking and screwing around, I suppose. Yeah, it would be nice to have a woman, but it's not real high on my priorities right now. If I find one, then we'll have to see what I do later. Pete and Fiona visited for several more minutes. She even drank one of his beers with him before she sighed and said she had to get back home to help with the chores. Before she walked off, she said, I'll see you around, I suppose, Sergeant. I hope you don't mind if I come by every so often and soak in the creek, do ya? No, hell, wouldn't matter if I did. It's your creek also. Your folks' land borders the south side of the creek, so you have as much right to swim in it as I do. Pete grinned and continued, besides, I like the view when you're washing off the dust. It might be a good thing if you made a little noise when you come down, though. I have been known to swim without anything on. Fiona turned and grinned at Pete. She looked him up and down and said, I've been known to do that also, but that was years ago before I figured out all you men are just waiting to pounce on us poor defenseless naked women. I may just sneak up on you, though. I might enjoy the view. She laughed and said, catch you later, Pete. 2 days later, Fiona was back. This time, she was raking the hay into windrows in preparation for baling it. After she completed that hot, dusty job, she once again drove down beside the small stream and stripped to a bathing suit. Pete had completed the short wall in the back of his cave by then and was working on the front wall. He had been watching her off and on as she worked. After he used the mortar he had prepared, he put his tools in a water bath and walked to the stream where Fiona was floating. Pete took off his shoes and waded out into the stream carrying a pool noodle. When he was in the deepest part, he floated on the noodle and said, Afternoon, Fiona. Mind if I join you for a while? Fiona smiled and said, Not at all. How's it going, Pete? The 2 young people visited for several minutes, then Pete decided he needed to return to work. He invited Fiona up for another beer before she left. Those 2 days seemed to set a precedent. For the rest of the week after Fiona finished her day's work in the field, she would meet Pete at the swimming hole and they would talk. After she finished her swim, she went to Pete's and had a beer or 2 with him and looked at the work he had accomplished while she had been gone. Pete's little home took shape rapidly. He had a 2-level floor inside the cave room. He even managed to pipe in water from the old well and set up a bathroom inside. He had a hell of a time breaking out enough rock to get the water lines and drain lines deep enough they would not freeze, but he was proud of his accomplishments. When he was done, the room under the natural rock was 24 by 15 feet. His bed was in the far rear of the small room. He built a small kitchen area on one side of the front and a sitting area on the other. His bathroom was behind the kitchen area. Pete was happy. He had placed a small wood stove in the room for winter heat. He was good to go. The best thing was he only spent about $3,700 on the building materials for his small room. After the hay was up, Pete did not see Fiona as often as he had when she was working across the stream from him. She still came to the swimming hole at least twice a week throughout the hot part of the year, though. To his surprise, Pete found himself looking forward to seeing her. He was disappointed when she did not show up. Finally, on a Wednesday, when they were floating in the stream, drinking a beer, Pete asked her out. Fiona looked at Pete in shock when he asked her for the date. She said, "You're kidding, right?" Pete's feelings were a little hurt when she said that. He said, "No, I wasn't. I was serious, but if you don't want to go, fine. I just thought we could go out and have some fun. I am sorry I suggested it." Fiona saw the hurt in Pete's face and said, "Hey, Pete, I didn't mean to upset you. I was just surprised is all. You've never given me any indication you thought I was anything except a beer-drinking buddy. Besides, I am a shot-up soldier. I can't dance and have trouble walking. My scars are hideous. I've not had a date since I was wounded, and you just surprised me, okay? If I didn't piss you off totally, yes. I would like to go out with you, okay? Pete found himself smiling. He said, great. But you've got it all wrong, Fiona. You may be shot up and have scars, but anyone who can't see what a great person you are doesn't deserve a date with you anyway. I just enjoy being with you. I don't give a rat's shit about the scars, and I never like to dance anyway. Pete was not the most observant person, but then what man is when it comes to women? He really didn't notice the way Fiona's eyes and face lit up when she heard him tell her he enjoyed being with her for her personality and inner beauty rather than her now damaged exterior. She felt her heart flutter when he said what he said. She could tell from the tone of his voice and his facial expression that he meant every word too. She felt her spirit lift higher than it had been since her injury. She wasn't in love with Pete, but she was well on her way after that statement. Pete and Fiona continued to date and visit back and forth throughout the long winter. She was amazed at how cozy his little home under the cliff was and enjoyed every moment she spent within it with Pete. One spring day, they were once again at Pete's home visiting. They were sitting on the front porch watching a typical spring thunderstorm when the wind began blowing much harder and the sky darkened horribly. They heard a loud roaring and his porch roof began rattling. Pete watched in amazement as the roof began flexing. The rain was coming down almost sideways and blowing all the way across his porch. All at once he understood what was happening and grabbed Fiona. He began dragging her toward his front door and shouted, "Tornado! Come on, hurry. We need to get inside under protection." Pete didn't stop when they got into the main room of his little home. Pete pulled Fiona to the back and into the small room he used for storage of his root crops and other bulk items. They closed the door and sat on the floor. After the door closed, they could barely hear the roaring of the storm. Soon they heard a crash of breaking glass, then shortly thereafter an eerie quiet descended on Pete's little farm. Pete waited for another 10 minutes, then he opened the door into his home and allowed Fiona to follow him out. One of the front windows had been broken. Part of the porch roof was thrown through it. Rain and debris had blown into the room. His bed was damp, but not horribly wet. The porch roof was gone, torn away by the wind. Pete walked out into the now softly falling rain and looked toward his machine shed. It too was gone. Some of the roof had fallen on his machinery. Many of the beautiful trees around his home were damaged, some uprooted. Fiona came to Pete and wrapped her arm around his waist. She leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "Oh, Pete, I am so sorry. Come on, let's see what the damage is." They first walked toward the shed. When they turned around the corner of the bluff, the cave was and they saw both their trucks. There was some damage from debris hitting them, and Fiona's front windshield was cracked and starred from a hit in the center by something large and heavy. Both vehicles appeared to be operable, however, even if Fiona's truck was not legal to drive with the damaged windshield. They walked on to the damaged machine shed. Much of Pete's machinery was bent and damaged from the building falling on it before blowing away. Some of the smaller pieces were rolled around the barnyard. He would have to clear the wreckage off before he could determine if it was damaged enough to be inoperable. He also had a lot of trees to cut and storm damage to repair. It was obvious, however, that this had not been a terribly strong tornado. Pete's machine shed was blown down more than blown away. Sure, some of the metal siding and roofing was completely gone, but much of the building was lying on top of the machinery stored inside. Fiona and Pete walked up onto the top of the bluff over the cave home and observed the storm's path. Fiona gasped and grabbed Pete's arm. She hysterically said, "Pete, it looks like the storm hit our farm. The house and barns are all damaged. I have to get home and check on Mom and Dad." She took off running or hobbling as fast as she could toward her truck. Pete ran to catch up to her. When Pete got to Fiona, she was trying to get into her truck. He grabbed her and held her back. He said, "Wait, Fiona. You can hardly see out of your front window. Come on. Let's get my chainsaw, some other tools and first aid kit, then we'll take my truck." Pete and Fiona rummaged around in his broken-down shed until they came up with the chainsaw, fuel and oil for it, as well as some ropes and chains, a come-along and a couple of heavy steel bars to pry with. They then drove out of his lane as fast as they safely could and turned toward Fiona's home. Twice they had to stop and cut trees from the road before they could proceed. Because they had to clear the road, it took them nearly 45 minutes to drive the 2 miles to her home. It would have been faster to go through the fields probably, except they would have had to cut one of the fences. When they arrived at Fiona's home, they saw the house and outbuildings were destroyed. Like Pete's machine shed, however, the buildings were more blown down than blown away. Fiona ran frantically around screaming for her parents. Finally, she and Pete heard a muted yell coming from within the wreckage of the house. Pete backed his truck as close as he could, and they began clearing wreckage from the area the noise was coming from. Fiona was crying as she frantically worked at the wreckage. There was a large tree lying over that corner of the house. After they got the tree cut away, Pete saw a broken-down cellar door partly covering steps into the cellar underneath the house. The yelling was coming from the cellar. They finished clearing the door and Fiona rushed down the stairs screaming for her parents. Pete followed her carrying a flashlight. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw Fiona hugging her father and mother. Pete walked up to Fiona and wrapped his arm around her waist to comfort her also. After the initial euphoria of finding each other safe, Fiona's father Seth began walking out of the cellar. When he got to the top of the stairs, he stopped and looked around his farm in shock. Fiona and her mother walked to each side of him and each wrapped an arm around his waist. Pete walked up beside them and stood in silence for a moment. After the three began slowly walking around surveying the damage, Pete followed Fiona. The rain was picking up once more, so he said, "Look folks, it's getting dark and the rain is picking up again. Why don't we all go to my place for the night? We can decide what we need to do in the morning and get started on rebuilding. My place isn't the most fancy or comfortable for all of us, but at least it will be dry and warm. I will have to put something over the broken window, then we'll build a fire and get comfy." The next morning, Fiona and her mother prepared breakfast on Pete's small wood stove. While they ate their meal, the four friends discussed how to recover from the disaster. Pete insisted Fiona and her parents planned to stay with him until they could get something set up for themselves. After the meal, they split. Seth, Bridget, and Fiona returned to their place in Fiona's truck. Pete went to town to purchase replacement material so he could replace the broken window and porch roof. He also turned his loss in to his insurance agent. They promised to have an adjuster out in the next day or two. Pete was instructed not to begin work rebuilding until after the adjuster had been there. He was allowed to replace the window only because that would safeguard his home from further damage. Pete also mentioned the damage at the Morgan's place. They also insured through the same agent, so he promised to have the adjuster visit them the same day. Pete returned home with his replacement window and spent the rest of the morning installing it. After that, he worked on his machine shed until he could get his tractor out. Some of the sheet metal was bent on the tractor, but it was otherwise undamaged. Now he was thankful he let the insurance agent talk him into getting a policy that covered his equipment, as well as the machine shed and his little shack of a home. Just before dark, Fiona and her father came back to Pete's with a mattress, refrigerator, and some bedding and clothing for them all. They also had some preserved food in the truck. Bridget had taken the family truck to town to purchase some groceries. They had gotten a generator running and plugged the deep freeze in to keep their frozen food cold. Pete also got his generator out to run his electric appliances until the power company could restore service. News broadcasts indicated it would probably be later the next day before service would be restored in their area. The next 10 days were hectic. The insurance adjuster was there and Pete was awarded $100,000 to rebuild his machine shed and 2 smaller outbuildings. He also was to receive $15,000 for the damage to his machinery and $7,500 for the damage to his small home. Much of the settlement was for labor to rebuild. Much of that would be pure profit for Pete because he intended to do almost all the work himself. He decided with that kind of money coming to him, he would increase the size of his home to include the 12 by 30-foot porch. He would add a new porch surrounding the 3 sides of the building now. Doing the work himself, it would take more than the $7,500 he received for the damage to the house, but not much more. He would then use the cave portion of the home for a bedroom and the new addition for living, kitchen, and office space. He would even build a larger bathroom just inside the cave with access from the new addition and his bedroom. Pete got busy digging the footings for his new porch 2 days after he got the promise on the amounts he would receive from the insurance adjuster. He used scrap materials from the blown-down buildings for the form work. He had the concrete poured and was ready to begin the construction by the time he received his check for the damage. He explained to Fiona and her family what he planned to do, and they were all for it. Pete planned to bite the bullet and use concrete for the wall of his new house, then he would put stone on the outside. He hated to spend the money, but he figured he had it now, and it would be worth it if he ever got hit by another tornado. It would also make it easier to heat and cool the house. Besides, the concrete would only cost about $2,500 if he did the work himself and bought ready mix, so he could do it all in one pour. He had worked with concrete several times in the military and knew how to do it. He would have to rent the equipment, but that cost would be negligible. Pete had the concrete poured and was waiting for it to cure enough to remove the forms and begin putting the roof on his new addition when his plans went awry. He received that all too familiar phone call from his reserve unit. Once again, his unit was being called to active duty for service in Afghanistan. He would be gone for a year once more. While he liked the money this would bring him, he really hated the fact he would have to leave his farm in the shape it was in. When Pete told Fiona and her parents that evening that he was being called to active duty once more, Fiona said, "Oh, crap." She then rushed to him for a hug. Pete rapidly told the three Morgans that they were more than welcome to continue living in his home until such time as they had their own house rebuilt. They had completed the cleanup of their house site and were waiting on a company to come in and build a steel building on a pad that would then be turned into a new home for the family. While they waited, they were continuing to work the farm and clean up the damaged outbuildings. The night before Pete left, much to his surprise, Fiona came to his bed in the middle of the night. He woke when he felt her crawl into bed with him. She gave him a hot kiss and almost immediately grabbed him. He pushed her back slightly and said, "Fiona, we can't do this now. Your parents are sleeping over there and will hear us for sure." This would not be the first time Pete and Fiona made love, and he was sure her parents knew they were intimate, but it still bothered Pete when he thought about doing the deed almost in their faces. Fiona, on the other hand, would not be dissuaded. She gave Pete a soul-searing kiss and hissed, "I don't care. Mother knows we are lovers, and I am sure Daddy does too. I want to spend one more full night with you before you leave, and I intend to do it." With almost no foreplay, Fiona pulled Pete and straddled him. They tried to be as quiet as they could, but when Fiona climaxed, she made enough noise both her parents surely heard. Of course, after the deed was done, the two lovers drifted off to sleep once more and didn't wake until Bridget was preparing breakfast. When she saw Pete rising from his bed, she poured 3 cups of coffee and placed them on the small table. She was grinning when a very sheepish Pete walked up for his coffee. Pete could not look her in the eyes this morning. Bridget took pity on Pete and said, "I wondered why you two weren't sleeping together before this. I know how you feel about each other, Pete. It's fine with Seth and me. Fiona is a woman grown, and if she wants to spend the night with her man, a man we all think highly of, then we have nothing to say about it." Finally, the day Pete had to report to his unit arrived. All 3 of the Morgans watched as Pete drove off to war once again. Fiona would pick up his truck after his unit deployed and return it to his farm. He had added her name to his checking account so she could pay his bills while he was gone. She and her father would farm his small acreage for the year he was deployed also. The first 3 days at the reserve center was typical of a unit mobilization. There was paperwork, and more paperwork. There was also the last-minute load out of equipment that had to be shipped over with them. The larger equipment they would use was already in theater, as was much of their smaller equipment that had been shipped out earlier. On departure day, to Pete's surprise, Fiona showed up with her parents to see him onto the bus for his departure. Many things were covered at the mobilization station. Medical and dental checks were done on all deploying soldiers. Personnel files were updated. There were legal and other briefings, as well as some concentrated training and weapons qualification. Pete made use of the legal update this deployment. He made a will leaving all his belongings to Fiona. He never told her about his decision. After 3 weeks at the mobilization station, Pete's unit of combat engineers was loaded onto aircraft and flown to Kazakhstan for a short acclimatization period before moving in country to relieve the engineer unit they were replacing. This replacement took place over a 30-day period. Then Pete's unit was solely responsible for engineer functions in their assigned area in support of local, Allied, and U.S. forces. Pete's unit arrived at the beginning of the local summer. By the time midsummer arrived, he was suffering through 130-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. It was miserably dry and dusty. They worked long days and many nights doing everything an engineer unit did. They did route clearance, built schools, roads, and other structures. They were shot at, cursed at, and always overworked. Pete loved it and hated it. Many days he took the opportunity to phone back home and talk to Fiona. The L word began to work its way into the conversations. Pete found himself thinking of her more and more often. He wondered if he did really love her, or if she was just a good friend, a sex buddy. He felt a deeper connection with her than he ever had with good old what's-her-name Polly. They were almost 3/4 through their deployment when disaster struck. The unit was working on a road out in the mountains when the terror attacked. After almost 30 minutes of constant fighting, Pete's platoon sergeant was hit. Pete was the next senior sergeant and found himself thrust into the job. To his credit, he took very little time in settling into the job. He had just become fully cognizant of the location of all platoon members when the platoon leader was also hit. Now Pete was in charge of what remained of an engineer platoon fighting for their lives. Pete saw a decrease in the level of fire in one sector he was responsible for and led an attack on the positions of the terrors. He and 13 of his remaining soldiers moved into the breach and began working down the line of the attackers. The support requested when the contact report was sent finally arrived. The attack helicopters concentrated their fire in support of Pete and his men. Within 10 minutes of Pete's counterattack, the terrors were routed and began withdrawing in defeat. By the time the reinforcements and relief force arrived, all that was left was the mopping up and treating of wounded before evacuation. Pete was left in the position of platoon sergeant after this action. He turned out to be not only gifted and highly competent in combat, but a superb platoon sergeant in the other aspects of his job. By the time he returned home, he had been promoted to platoon sergeant, E7. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his leadership during the terrorist attack. Finally, the day all deployed reservists longed for arrived. They were replaced and returned to the United States, where their unit was demobilized for return to home station. As has become normal in many towns, when their National Guard or Reserve unit returns from deployment, Pete's unit was met by throngs of happy friends and family when the plane landed. To Pete's surprise, Fiona threw herself into his arms when he made his way into the crowd, hoping to find his truck waiting for him so he could return to his small farm and relaxing surroundings. Pete almost fell when Fiona launched herself into his arms. She wrapped her legs around his hips and her arms around his chest and locked her lips onto his. "Oh, Pete, I've missed you so much. I am so happy you're home," she said. "Come on, I've got your truck. What do you want to do first?" "It's almost noon. I would really like to get some good food. What they served us was fine, but I want to hit all my favorite restaurants as soon as I can. I've missed pizza and good steaks more than anything. I think right now, though, I would like to have a pizza from the House of Pizza. It was one of my favorite places when I was going to college here in town. I've dreamed of one of their homemade pizzas almost since we got to Afghanistan. After that, I just want to go home and sleep for 24 hours. Then I want to eat some more." When they arrived at the House of Pizza, they took Pete's favorite table. Pete and Fiona were talking to each other and holding hands across the table when a very pregnant waitress walked up. She pulled her order pad from her pocket and turned to take their order. When her eyes hit Pete, she dropped her pad and turned white. Then she almost yelled, "Pete, oh my God, I've been looking all over for you, honey. Where have you been? It's so good to see you again. I've really missed you." She leaned down and tried to hug and kiss Pete. Pete looked up and saw Polly. He jumped back to avoid her attempted hug. It had been over 2 years since they broke up, and she was the last person he was thinking about. He said, "Hello, Polly." He glanced at her pregnant stomach and continued, "I see you found another boyfriend. Or is that a result of your running around with the skanks you call friends?" Polly left in tears and disappeared into the kitchen. Soon another waitress came to their table and requested their order in a surly manner. Pete was almost afraid to give it to her for fear they might do something in the back to damage the pizza or make it unsafe to eat somehow. Polly had been known in the past to do things like that in fits of anger to get her perceived revenge against some slight. He looked at Fiona and said, "You know, I think maybe we should just leave. I have lost my appetite after talking with your friend in there." Without a word, Fiona stood and waited for Pete to rise also. She stepped to him and gave him a kiss, then said, "Honey, I have to use the restroom before we go. I'll just be a minute." The waitress glared at Fiona, then stomped back into the kitchen. Pete stood beside the front door waiting on Fiona. After a few minutes, he heard voices raised in anger coming from the back of the restaurant. They seemed to be coming from the hallway to the restrooms. He moved so he could see down the hallway and saw Fiona and Polly facing each other. Their faces showed their anger. They were talking animatedly. Pete walked toward the women. He was about halfway across the floor when he heard Polly say, "I still want to know what you're doing with my fiancé, you crippled up little bitch. I heard his unit was called up, but now that he's back, I intend to marry him. So you need to just back off, honey." Fiona laughed and replied, "Honey, he wouldn't marry you after what you've done to him if you were his last chance for matrimony. I can't believe you were so damn stupid that you would leave his arms and bed to play around with your skanky girlfriends for a summer. I know he promised you that if you did that he would never be your man again. What's the matter? Didn't you believe him?" Fiona looked at Polly's baby bump and continued, "What happened? You need a papa for your little scumsucker, and when you saw Pete you thought you could talk him into filling the bill? I wonder if this is the only little scumsucker you have. Did you maybe find another one on your little sex trip? Now bitch, I suggest you just trot back into the kitchen and hide or get back to work one. My man and I are leaving. Before I go though, I want to leave you with a little advice. I am a retired Army sergeant. I learned how to handle little bitches like you when I get pissed off. I can guarantee you don't want to piss me off. It would piss me off royally if I thought you were trying to steal my man. You had your chance and you blew it. Now get over it and find another one." Fiona turned and walked toward Pete. When she reached him, she blushed slightly and wrapped her arm in his. She looked up at Pete and said, "I am sorry you heard that, Pete. I hope you don't think I am overstepping my boundaries. Now can we find something to eat then get home? All at once I really want to get out of this town." When Pete turned down the lane to his house, Fiona became really animated. She was almost bouncing on her seat. To Pete, her expression looked like a mixture of excitement and fear. Finally, just before they came into sight of his yard, he asked, "Fiona, what's the matter with you? Why are you looking so nervous all at once?" Well, you know how you gave me authority to write checks on your account to pay your bills while you were gone? I sort of spent a lot of your money, and now I am afraid you might be a little upset about it. Dad and Mom thought it was a good idea, and I guess we just talked each other into doing it. I am sorry if I did wrong. Pete was watching Fiona, trying to decide just what she had done that she thought would upset him. He was almost to where he normally parked his truck before what he was seeing registered in his brain. His house was finished. It was roofed, there was a covered porch on 3 sides, and was rocked just as he had described wanting it before he left. There were flower beds and shrubs in a beautifully landscaped yard. His machine shed had been rebuilt and was even a little larger than before. He stopped the truck and sat looking at his little farm in shock. He felt his stomach clench. From the looks of things, Fiona must have spent everything he received from the insurance, and perhaps a little more. He turned to her. He felt his face puckering in anger. He fought to keep his voice civil. He said, "Fiona, it looks like you spent my whole insurance check, and maybe even some of the army pay they deposited in my accounts. You knew I planned to do the work myself and save some of the money. I didn't want to spend all the money on labor. I wanted to upgrade my machinery too if I could." Fiona broke in on his conversation. She said, "No, Pete, I didn't. I wouldn't do that. I did just what you said you intended to do. I tried to only do what you said you wanted for the house and the machine shed. I didn't pay a dime for labor. Everything here was done by Dad. Mom and I are free by some of our friends and neighbors. A lot of the neighbors pitched in to help our local hero. Come on, I want to show it to you. I know you'll like it. Please don't get pissed off until you see it." Fiona pushed Pete toward his truck door. After they were outside, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the house. She rushed to the door and waited for him to enter the room built on the slab that had been his first front porch. She walked to his desk and pulled his bank book from it. She handed it to him, then turned the computer on. When the computer was booted, she loaded Quicken and showed him a report of all the expenses for the rebuilding she had authorized. Pete was shocked at the balance shown in his accounts. Fiona had only spent about half what he estimated it would have cost to do the work himself. He sat on his desk chair and clicked his way through several accounts and pages of the reports. He turned to Fiona and said, "How did you do that? You only spent a little over half what I thought materials would cost to finish the job." Fiona smiled and said, "Well, I sort of worked a deal with some of the suppliers. We got a lot of the materials at dealer cost or at a deep discount because of your service. We told the dealers you were deployed in Afghanistan and we were rebuilding your farm buildings that were damaged in the tornado before you were deployed. They gave us some really great deals when we explained labor was being donated as a thank you for our local hero. Sometimes they even donated things they said would make the rebuild better or substituted more expensive items than we ordered." Fiona looked at a shocked Pete and held her hand out to him. She continued, "Come on, honey. I want you to see the machine shed and shop we built for you too. Then I promised Mom and Dad we would come to their house for supper." Pete followed Fiona around his yard and machine shed in shock. It was exactly as he had described it when telling her about his plans. In some cases, it was even better. Fiona and her crew even installed compressed air lines to several strategic places in the shed. There was a pit in the floor so he could get under machinery to work if he needed to. The pit was capable of being covered for safety if not in use. After they finished in the new machine shed, Fiona led Pete outside and pointed out the fact they even cleaned up the damaged trees from the tornado. She showed him a new shed built behind his house where all the firewood had been stored out of the weather. Pete was reeling in shock when Fiona led him back into his house and showed him his bedroom inside the old cave. She gently pushed the door closed and turned to Pete. She moved to him and wrapped him in her arms before giving him a kiss. At first the kiss was gentle, then it became more demanding. Pete felt Fiona's tongue moving into his mouth. She plastered her body to his and moaned. He moaned and began gently caressing her body. Clothing began flying, dropping onto the floor haphazardly. Pete and Fiona collapsed onto his large bed. Pete's mind was reeling. He was lost in a morass of lust. His entire universe consisted of the beautiful creature receiving pleasure from him and giving him pleasure back. They moved together. They have wild sex. Pete leaned down and kissed Fiona, then collapsed to the side with a sigh. He lay on his back and pulled her to his naked and rapidly cooling body. She laid her head on his shoulder and threw her injured leg over his thigh. She then pulled him to her. Fiona looked at Pete's face and sighed, then whispered, "I've missed you so much. I love you, Pete. I was so worried about you while you were over there." Pete moved his head slightly and gave Fiona a gentle kiss. He whispered back, "I love you too, Fiona. After seeing and feeling what I have with you, I am sure I never loved Polly. I don't think I even knew what love was until I met you. Before you had that field baled and the hay hauled, and I think I loved you more than I ever did Polly. I love just being with you. sitting quietly or loving or working. It doesn't matter. Anything I do with you is better than anything I do without you or with others. After a short nap, Pete rose from his bed. He quietly moved out of the bedroom without waking Fiona. He went to his refrigerator and found his favorite Dos Equis lager stocked. He took a beer and moved out onto his front porch. He took a seat in his new porch chairs and sat looking over the stream at the Morgan's hay field while he sipped his beer. Pete sat quietly listening to the sounds of his home. Cattle were lowing in the background. Occasionally, he heard a dog bark or rooster crow. One of the neighbors was operating his tractor. All this was overlaying the gentle chuckle of the small spring running down the hill beside his cave home on its way to join the larger stream near the swimming hole. Pete hadn't even thought about the fact he was naked. He was home. His house was not in sight of the road, and he was used to sitting naked. He heard the door open and turned to see an equally naked Fiona move out of the house. She stood beside him. Her eyes were glistening. Her face was shining and soft-looking. He was captivated by the rising and falling of them as she breathed. Pete forced himself to look higher, and he said quietly, "You are so beautiful, Fiona. God, I love you." Fiona choked back a cry. She felt her eyes water and said, "No, I am not. I am covered in scars now, but I love you for saying that." Pete wrapped his arm around her and pulled her gently to him. He said, "Yes, you are beautiful, Fiona. You're all woman and put together perfectly. I am really getting tired of you complaining about your honorable markings. Even with those scars, you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. They just add to your beauty. They show your inner strength and dedication to those in your care. They show the kind of woman you are, and I love you all the more for them. Now why don't you sit here with me for a while? I want to relax and enjoy my peace and quiet until I finish this beer, then we'll go to your folks." During the trip to Fiona's parents' farm, Pete reconnected with his home area. He was sickened by the devastation still apparent from the tornado. Trees were horribly disfigured. Many were still down in tangled piles rotting away. It was so saddening to see nature destroyed like that. Pete knew it was nature's way, but it still hurt to see. When they drove into the yard at Fiona's parents' home, Pete was impressed. He could still see the destruction from the tornado, but the farm was already recovering. The barns were all rebuilt, as was the house. The trees that remained had been trimmed and were showing new growth. He thought the house looked strange. It was a metal shoebox with a roof and small porch over the door. He missed the older, well-maintained two-story house the tornado had blown down. Pete was met in the yard by Seth and Bridget. Seth stood back grinning while Bridget wrapped Pete in a hug. After she moved back, Seth stepped in and shook Pete's hand, then said, "Welcome home, Sergeant. We're all glad you made it back safely. Now maybe these women folk of mine will quit worrying so much about you and get a full night's sleep for a change." After a wonderful meal, the four friends sat in the yard visiting while night fell. Finally, about 9 p.m., Pete was about to pass out from exhaustion. He said, "It was great being here with you all, but I am just dead. I need to get home and sleep for about a week. Thank you for the wonderful meal and the nice welcome home." Pete stood and moved to shake Seth's hand. When he stepped back, Bridget wrapped him in another hug, then said, "Now you don't stay away, Pete. We want you to come back real soon." To Pete's surprise, she gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, then stepped back. Her eyes were glistening. Pete smiled, then turned to walk toward his truck. Fiona hugged her mother and father, then moved to catch up with Pete. She wrapped her arm around him and leaned her head on his shoulder. When they got to his truck, he opened the door and pulled Fiona to him for a deep kiss. She stepped back and began to climb into his truck. He watched her with surprise on his face. Pete asked, "What are you doing, Fiona?" Fiona looked worried, upset. She said, "Pete, I am going with you, honey. If you don't want me, I'll understand, but I want to go with you and be with you. Please?" I told Mom and Dad. "Of course Pete paused and gathered his thoughts. Finally, he began speaking once more. He said, "Fiona, you know I love you, but is this what you really want? I would love to take you back home with me tonight. Nothing would please me more than to have you move in with me, but we have to think about what would happen to your reputation here. What will your parents think? What will the neighbors think? Worse, what will everyone say, and how will they treat you if you do this? I want you to be with me more than I've ever wanted to be with a woman, but I want it to be right with you too." Fiona smiled at Pete and said, "Pete, this is right. I knew before you left that I loved you fully and completely. I wanted to have this conversation before we got here tonight, but we got busy doing other things, and I never found the way to ask. Pete, I told Polly today you were my man. I meant that. I love you. I want to spend time with you if you'll have me. Hell, I want to spend what is left of my life with you. I am complete and serene when you are with me. I feel like some of me is missing when we are separated. I know I am not perfect, but I'll try to be anything you want me to be for you." Pete looked at Fiona for a long few seconds, then got into the truck without a word. He looked up toward the house after he closed the door. Seth and Bridget were standing where they could see the truck. Seth had his arm around Bridget's shoulder. They were just watching Pete's truck and the two young people. When they saw him looking at them, they both raised their hands and waved. Bridget turned slightly toward Seth and wrapped her other arm around him, then laid her head on his chest. Pete started his truck and drove down the Morgans' driveway. He stopped at the road to check for oncoming traffic, then turned toward his home. When he started moving, Fiona scooted closer to him and rested her head on his right shoulder. She put her left hand on his thigh and looked up at him. When they got to Pete's house, they walked arm in arm to it. Pete opened the front door and let Fiona enter before him. Fiona turned the overhead light on. He looked at her for a moment and moved to his duffel bag. It was resting on the couch where he dropped it when they got home that afternoon. Pete began pulling things from the bag and throwing them onto the floor. Finally, right at the bottom, he pulled a set of combat boots from it. He turned the right boot upside down and shook it until a small box fell into his other hand. Pete dropped the boot he was holding, stood and walked to a puzzled Fiona. He opened the box and took a ring from it. He looked at Fiona. Her eyes got larger and she gasped. Pete said, "Fiona, I love you. I've told you that several times. I wanted to do this soon, but I was hoping for a special time to do it. I suppose if you're going to sleep here with me, we need to make it sort of official anyway. Fiona, will you marry me?" Fiona was pressing her lips together. She nodded her head yes and held her left hand out. It was shaking slightly. She watched with her face glowing while Pete slid the ring slowly onto the left ring finger. After he let her hand go, Fiona wrapped him in her arms and whispered, "Yes, Pete Johnson, I'll marry you. I've wanted to spend my life with you almost from the first time I met you. You are the first person who has treated me normally since I was shot up. I fell in love with you for that, and because you treated me like an equal instead of a piece of meat to screw and leave or an air-headed female. My love for you grew when I realized you cared about what I thought and listened to what I said. You treat me like a friend, a partner, and yet you treat me like the most precious thing you have too. I love you for all you are, and for the way you treat me." Fiona smiled and continued, "Now, let's get showered off and get you to bed. We have to go over to Dad's tomorrow and show off my ring and get more of my clothes." Pete looked at Fiona while he digested what she had just said. He said, "More of your clothes?" Fiona blushed and nodded her head yes. She said, "I hope you don't mind, but I have been spending a lot of my time here. I have already come to feel as if this is our house. I feel more comfortable here than in Dad's new house. Since I was watching your place for you, I just brought a lot of my clothes here, so I would have them when I needed them." Pete laughed and finished undressing. He pushed Fiona toward then into the shower with him. They took a fast but thoroughly enjoyable shower with each other. They stumbled toward the bed in a high state of excitement. They both made love, a passionate love. Pete was almost too tired to take care of her before he dropped off to sleep. Fiona smiled and rolled onto her side beside her man. She threw her injured leg and the corresponding arm over Pete and followed him to sleep. The next morning as dawn was breaking, they woke in the same position, still uncovered. Pete had to piss bad enough he was afraid he would leak onto the bed. He carefully moved out from under Fiona to head to the bathroom. When he got finished, he walked back into the bedroom to find Fiona missing. He turned and walked into the main part of the house and found her in the kitchen preparing coffee. Fiona looked up at Pete and smiled. She said, "Why don't you go out on the porch and enjoy the morning while I finish the coffee, honey? I'll bring you a cup when it's finished." Pete did as Fiona suggested. He sat and watched the sun come up over the trees. He could see the rays of light lancing through the fog rising from the stream. He felt himself relax as he listened to the neighbors' livestock and the birds. Pete was surprised when Fiona walked up and handed him his coffee. She was naked as he was. She smiled down at him and moved to a chair beside him. To his surprise, she pulled the chair toward the edge of the porch and sat in it facing him. She started teasing him. She looked in his eyes and smiled. Fiona smiled at Pete again and licked her lips. After she had her first swallow of coffee, she smiled once again and said, "You see anything you like here, soldier man?" Pete grinned and said, "Oh, yeah. I've really missed looking out over the stream at your folks' hayfield." Fiona looked shocked for a moment, then grinned back at him and muttered, "You a hole? I ought to go in and get dressed. That'd teach you a lesson, I bet." "No, there's no need to do that. I do see some other things worth looking at now that you mention it." Pete leered at Fiona and very obviously looked at her. "You know it's dangerous to tease a man who's been without sex and in the wilds of Afghanistan as long as I have been. It could go really hard on you, you know." Fiona laughed and said, "I sure hope so. I think we need to drink our coffee and reintroduce them to each other before we have breakfast and go over to the folks." Deal. After a robust reintroduction, Pete and Fiona took a little nap before she prepared, and they ate what Pete refers to as a real breakfast. Fiona made biscuits, ham and eggs, and hash browns. Of course, there was more coffee to go with the meal. She quickly loaded the dishwasher before they threw on their outer clothes and took off for her parents' home. They arrived just as Seth and Bridget were sitting down to lunch. Bridget looked up when the young couple walked into the kitchen. She jumped up and began setting 2 more places at the table for them to eat. Fiona looked guilty and said, "Don't do that, Mama. We just finished breakfast about 15 minutes ago. Neither one of us is hungry." "Fiona Morgan, whatever were you doing that you made Pete wait until noon for breakfast? I thought I raised you better than that." Seth snorted and then laughed. Bridget turned to glare at him, then she blushed. She looked hurriedly toward Fiona to see her covered in a deep blush. Her mouth dropped open in shock, then she too turned deep red. "Oh," she whispered. She rapidly turned to her lunch and began eating. Fiona moved to the cabinet and took out 2 glasses. She put ice in them, then filled them with iced tea. She walked up to Pete and handed him one. Before she stepped back, she gave him a quick, gentle kiss. She sat at the table beside her mother and stuck her left hand out over her mother's plate. Bridget looked down at the hand, then squealed. She grabbed Fiona's hand to steady it while she looked at the engagement ring. After her parents finished their lunch, Fiona helped her mother clear the table and do dishes. Seth took Pete out to sit in the yard and visit. Pete and Fiona took a load of her belongings back to his home when they left that day. They continued to work his little 80-acre farm. He stayed in the reserves. Additionally, they helped with the work on Fiona's parents' farm. As the years progressed, they took over complete operation of both farms. After their second child was born, the 2 families traded homes, and Seth and Bridget lived in Pete's old cave home until they both passed away. Pete retired from the USAR after 40 years as a command sergeant major. His and Fiona's youngest son continued to operate the combined farms. In their turn, Pete and Fiona moved back into the cave home and let their son and his family have the larger main house. During his life, Pete made and kept 3 major promises. He promised Polly if she left to play around, he would never be in her bed again. He promised to love, honor, and cherish Fiona until death did them part, which he did. He promised her father that he would care for his daughter, which he did. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.